A trail camera sits bolted to a cypress trunk in the Big Cypress National Preserve. For weeks it has recorded nothing but wind moving through sawgrass. Then, in December 2022, it captures something wildlife biologists had never documented before. A 25-pound bobcat standing over the headless body of a 52-pound, 13-foot Burmese python. The snake, nicknamed Loki, had been fitted with a radio transmitter as part of a long-running python tracking program. Researchers with the Conservancy of Southwest Florida were simply following his signal when they found his remains near Naples. His head and neck separated from his body. The carcass cached under debris the way a cat stashes a meal for later. When biologist Ian Bertashek reviewed what the camera had captured, he didn't hesitate to call it what it was: a native predator taking down an invasive apex predator on its own turf. That's a win for the home team, he told local reporters at the time. It sounds like a small story. A single bobcat, a single dead snake, in a swamp that holds, by some estimates, tens of thousands of Burmese pythons. But scientists studying the Everglades say this kind of footage matters, because for 20 years the story of this ecosystem has run in exactly one direction. The invader wins. The natives disappear. This is the first hard evidence that the tide might be more complicated than that. To understand why one bobcat matters, you have to understand what the Everglades has already lost, and what else has been quietly moving through the swamp alongside the snakes everyone already knew about. Before any of this, the Everglades wasn't just a swamp. It was closer to a slow-moving river of grass, stretching across roughly 1.5 million acres of subtropical wetland in South Florida. It filtered drinking water for millions of people, absorbed storm surge, and supported a food web that had been intact for thousands of years. Raccoons and possums working the waterlines, bobcats, and the endangered Florida panther patrolling the hammocks. Wading birds moving through the sawgrass prairies in numbers that used to darken the sky. Then, in August 1992, Hurricane Andrew tore through South Florida as a Category 5 storm. Among the buildings it destroyed was a reptile breeding facility near Miami, and an unknown number of Burmese pythons are believed to have escaped into the surrounding wetlands. Andrew wasn't the whole story, though. Throughout the 1980s and 90s, Burmese pythons were also a popular exotic pet, sold cheaply at reptile expos to buyers who often had no idea a hatchling the size of a bracelet would eventually become a 100-plus pound predator capable of swallowing an alligator. When those snakes outgrew their owner's patience, more than a few ended up released at the edge of the Everglades. Whatever the exact mix of causes, by the early 2000s the population had established itself and begun to explode. The heat, the humidity, and an abundance of native prey species that had no evolutionary experience with a giant ambush predator gave the pythons everything they needed. A Burmese python can top 200 pounds and 16 feet, hunts using heat-sensing pits along its jaw that detect warm-blooded prey in total darkness. And a single female can lay a clutch of 50 to 100 eggs a year. With no natural predators of their own in Florida, the math did the rest. In January 2012, a team led by researchers from Davidson College, the U.S. Geological Survey, and Virginia Tech published a study in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences that quantified, for the first time, what pythons had done to the mammals of Everglades National Park. The team compared nighttime road surveys driven between 2003 and 2011, nearly 57,000 kilometers of them, against baseline surveys from the mid-1990s, before pythons were established. The results were stark. Raccoon sightings had dropped by 99.3%. Opossum sightings were down 98.9%. White-tailed deer sightings had fallen by 94.1%. And bobcats by 87.5%. Marsh rabbits and foxes weren't seen at all during the later surveys, effectively erased from the areas where pythons were most established. The declines were worst in the park's remote southern reaches, where pythons had been present longest and mildest at the edges of their range, a pattern the researchers said strongly implicated the snakes rather than some unrelated disease or environmental shift. As one of the study's co-authors, John Wilson of Virginia Tech, put it at the time, the changes suggested pythons were reshaping the entire structure of the Everglades animal community. Florida's response was, for years, an uphill fight against a nearly invisible enemy. Biologists estimate that only about 1% of the pythons in South Florida are ever seen or captured, which makes population estimates, commonly cited in the tens of thousands to as high as 100,000 or more, inherently uncertain. Public hunting events, like the annual Florida Python Challenge, have removed hundreds of snakes at a time, and professional contracted hunters working for the South Florida Water Management District and the Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission have removed tens of thousands of pythons since organized removal efforts began in the mid-2000s. Even so, most researchers agree that removal at current rates is not close to reducing the overall population. It's closer to triage than eradication. While pythons were drawing headlines, something smaller and far less visible was spreading through the same wetlands. In 2012, University of Florida invasion ecologist Melissa Miller identified a parasite living in the lungs of Burmese pythons in South Florida, a crustacean-like organism called Reintroduced orientalis, commonly known as snake lungworm. It's native to Southeast Asia and Africa, and it almost certainly hitched a ride into Florida inside the pythons themselves. The lungworm's life cycle is genuinely unusual. An infected snake sheds parasite eggs in its waste. Cockroaches consume the waste and pick up the larvae. Frogs, lizards, and other small animals eat the cockroaches. A snake then eats one of those infected prey animals, and the larvae migrate out of the digestive tract and into the lungs, where they mature, feed on blood, and reproduce. Burmese pythons, having evolved alongside this parasite in Asia for millennia, tolerate it reasonably well. Florida's native snakes have no such history. Infections have been linked to lesions, pneumonia, sepsis, and death, with some snakes found with worms visibly emerging from their mouths as they died. What makes this parasite especially concerning to researchers is that it no longer needs pythons to keep spreading. It has jumped fully into native snake populations and now moves between them on its own. According to the Snake Lungworm Alliance and Monitoring Network, a collaborative research effort founded in 2022 by University of Central Florida biologist Jenna Palmisano, the parasite has now been documented in at least 18 native Florida snake species and has been detected in roughly 25 Florida counties, with confirmed cases as far north as St. Johns County, near Jacksonville, hundreds of miles from where pythons are established. That means even a scenario in which every python in Florida vanished tomorrow would not stop the lungworm spread. Amid that grim picture, researchers have flagged one genuine puzzle. The Florida cottonmouth, a venomous, semi-aquatic pit viper found throughout the same infected habitat, appears to tolerate the parasite far better than other native species. Cottonmouths test positive for infection at meaningful rates, but they haven't shown the same population declines associated with the disease in other snakes. Nobody has yet identified the underlying mechanism, whether it's immune response, blood chemistry, or something else. But researchers involved with the lungworm monitoring effort consider it one of the more urgent open questions in Florida wildlife disease research, precisely because understanding it could eventually help other species. In the middle of two overlapping invasions, Florida conservationists have also been running one of the more counterintuitive projects in the state, deliberately releasing more snakes into the wild. The eastern indigo snake is the longest native snake in North America, capable of reaching around 8 to 9 feet, with iridescent blue-black scales and a diet built almost entirely around other reptiles. It is immune to the venom of every pit viper native to the southeast, rattlesnakes, copperheads, and cottonmouths alike, and it hunts by pinning and swallowing prey rather than constricting it. Historically, it was the apex predator of the longleaf pine forest floor across much of North Florida and southern Georgia. The eastern indigo's disappearance from much of its historic range had nothing to do with pythons. It was driven by the loss of longleaf pine forest, and critically, by the decline of gopher tortoises, whose burrows indigo snakes depend on for shelter from Florida's temperature extremes. As 20th century development and fire suppression fragmented that habitat, indigo populations collapsed. By the early 1980s, the species had effectively vanished from the Nature Conservancy's Apalachicola Bluffs and Ravines Preserve in the Florida Panhandle, where it hadn't been documented since 1982. Starting in 2017, the Nature Conservancy, the Central Florida Zoo's Orion Center for Indigo Conservation, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and a coalition of other partners began releasing captive-bred, 2-year-old indigo snakes at the preserve as part of a long-term reintroduction program, part of a broader multi-decade effort to restore the longleaf pine ecosystem the snakes need. Every snake released is microchipped so researchers can track survival and movement over time. In the fall of 2023, that program reached a milestone nobody had been certain would come this soon. Field biologist Michelle Hoffman and her team discovered 2 untagged eastern indigo snake hatchlings on the property, offspring of previously released adults, born in the wild rather than raised in captivity. It was the first confirmed evidence of wild reproduction of the species in North Florida in roughly 40 years. As U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service biologist Michelle Elmore said at the time, the discovery showed the reintroduction was successfully re-establishing the species where it once lived. Since that first discovery, the program has continued expanding. More than 200 snakes released at the Florida site alone as of 2025, additional wild-born snakes documented in subsequent survey seasons, and a related older reintroduction effort in Alabama's Conecuh National Forest, producing its own wild-born hatchlings as early as 2020. It's worth noting that the eastern indigo snake is not entirely insulated from the lungworm crisis. Researchers monitoring Rhylidiella orientalis have found the parasite in indigo snakes as well, particularly in Georgia populations sampled through the broader monitoring network. That doesn't erase the significance of the Apalachicola reintroduction, but it does complicate the picture. A species being painstakingly restored in one part of its range is, in other parts, already contending with the same invisible threat spreading out from the python invasion. The Loki encounter that opened this story wasn't an isolated data point. It fits into a small but growing body of documented cases in which native Florida predators have preyed on Burmese pythons, something that was essentially unrecorded before the last few years. In 2021, U.S. Geological Survey trail cameras in Big Cypress National Preserve captured an even more detailed sequence. A bobcat discovering an unguarded python nest, eating and caching the eggs over several days, and then, when the mother python returned, engaging in a direct physical confrontation with a much larger snake, trading blows before retreating. USGS researchers described it as the first documented case of any Florida animal preying on python eggs, and the first clear evidence of a native species actively contesting a python rather than simply avoiding one. A separate 2021 study from the same research group documented a Florida black bear attacking an adult female python, which survived the encounter, but was clearly not an easy target. None of this amounts to pythons being under serious threat from native predators. Bobcats, for their part, have also turned up as prey inside python stomachs, and the relationship clearly runs both directions. But researchers who track pythons for a living, including Bertashek's team at the Conservancy of Southwest Florida, describe a pattern they didn't expect to see this soon. Native predators treating pythons as a food source rather than simply losing ground to them. It's a far cry from a turnaround, but it does mean the story is no longer a one-way slaughter. Put all of this together, and the picture that emerges from the Everglades isn't the simple invasion narrative most people know. Invader arrives, native species vanish, story over. It's something messier and, in its own way, more scientifically interesting. An apex invasive predator that is still winning by sheer numbers. A parasite it brought with it that no longer needs it to keep spreading. A once vanished native apex predator being painstakingly reintroduced into the same landscape. And native mammals that, after 2 decades of being eaten in silence, are beginning, in small documented, camera-verified instances, to fight back. Nobody studying the system is claiming victory. And nobody is predicting the Everglades will simply return to what it was before 1992. What the last few years of research and trail camera evidence suggest instead is that the ecosystem is still actively reorganizing itself, years after most outside observers assumed the outcome was already settled. The mammal declines documented in 2012 haven't reversed. The lungworm is still spreading north, but the presence of a bobcat willing to take on a python and a hatchling indigo snake born wild for the first time in 40 years are reminders that even a badly damaged ecosystem doesn't necessarily stop responding. It just takes longer and looks different than anyone expected.